Hey everybody, I'm Bill Calkins, Senior Editor with Grower Talks, and as we near the end of poinsettia production season and start sending them to market, this webinar is very timely and relevant. It's the third in this three-part series, and our topic today will help you finish your crop with a bang, from Bract development and the final stages of production. I'm excited to be joined by two experts who represent Selecta One, working with growers across North America. These are the same guys who tackled part two. And I've heard from many growers across North America that they really enjoyed the dialogue. So I'm confident that this webinar is going to take on the same sort of casual conversational tone. It's kind of like hanging out with two growers who've had a lot of experience with a crop and love sharing tips and tricks. So let's meet our guests. First, joining me is Gary Vollmer, who brings decades of industry experience propagating, growing, selecting. This guy's done just about every horticultural job imaginable. And with that experience comes the knowledge to share with you today. So Gary, how are growers doing with their poinsettia crops this year?
You know, overall, I'd say it's a good start. Everybody seems like we're progressing nicely. We don't have any major problems. There were some delivery challenges for the cuttings, clearly with COVID, but you know, for the most part, I think growers are intact. We've had some heat in some pockets that have, usual suspects, Texas heat at the wrong week, et cetera. But other than those types of scenarios, overall, I'd say we're in a solid position going forward.
Excellent. That's really good to hear. And hopefully the audience will agree with you. Next
If they don't,
is James
ask some
Dukas.
questions.
Right, exactly. So next is James Dukas, who covers a really big territory for Selecta One and also has plenty of greenhouse experience that he's going to share with you today. So James, in terms of the growers that you work with, how are they progressing on their crops?
Right now, things are kind of growing extremely well, almost too well. We've got east of the Mississippi. It's a little bit cooler than normal. We've been dealing with past couple of years a tremendous amount of heat and 90s, every single day. Now we're in the sweet spot where it's only highs in the 80s. So poinsettias are not slowing down at all.
Okay, well, and I would imagine that creates its own set of challenges, and but probably nothing that growers haven't dealt with in the past. So maybe you guys will talk a little bit about that during this webinar.
That is absolutely the point, Bill. We want to focus on current events right now. Good. So please, if you guys have questions, send them in through the chat and question line.
For sure, for sure. So we're going to go ahead and get this rolling. I am going to do a little bit of housekeeping real quick before we get started to let you know that this webinar will be recorded and will be available in archived form at growertalks.com/webinars, along with tons of others. There's all sorts of content at the webinars site, including the first two webinars in this series. In addition, as Gary mentioned, when you do have questions throughout this presentation, go ahead and post them in the Q&A section. You can find that probably at the bottom of your screen. And our panelists might see your question and answer them on the fly, but more likely I'll come back in at the end and do my best to ask the panelists those questions. We'll get through as many as we can before we close today. So, gentlemen, I think it's all yours. Go ahead and share your screen and take it away, and I will be back in a bit to get through any questions from the audience.
All right, so can you guys see my screen?
Looks good.
Okay, very good.
Not good now.
Now we lost you.
Okay.
Now dog.
Oh, now you're back.
We're back. All right, very good. I had it. It was a floating window. I needed to park it somewhere. Apologize for that. Technical difficulties. All right. So welcome aboard, guys. What we want to do is we want to really kind of talk about what's left in the poinsettia season from now. We've tried to get ahead of the curve in the first two webinars, and we will readdress some of these core issues in this one as well, simply because we need to deal with the current events, what's right in front of you, as well as the stuff's to come here in the next month or two. So that being said, we're going to focus on sort of core growing attributes, the environment, moisture management, nutrition management, disease control, all these aspects. that are so critical to just maintaining what we're doing and continuing the normal growth of the poinsettia. But we'll also look at how the environment's going to change, how the season will change, and how those factors will influence these different parameters. So we're going to look at them again holistically, but also with the lens of what's to come. All right, so keep that in mind as we go through all of this. So just to get started here, and get this going. Okay, let's talk about some key environmental factors. Temperature, light, and humidity are your three big things that we need to pay out. Lights out. Now, poinsettias are short day obligate plants. You are in the window where initiation is occurring. It is hyper important that no light pollution get to the poinsettia crop from now really until about October 10th. And it's really critical that we keep this focus on that aspect of it, because any light that you get now, 10-foot candles is all it takes. One night in the equation is all it takes. It will mess up the flower development. One of my favorite scenarios was a grower who you could see literally the headlight pattern of the truck that came once a week to change the porta potty. And you could literally see where this truck parked when he was changing the porta potty, those two headlight beams. So you think about that is an event that was a few minutes every week was enough to affect this crop. So keep them in the dark, keep it dark. If you're not sure, hang out in your greenhouse after dark to see, is there a street light from across the street? Is there something happening? Are you on a busy corner where there's headlights popping in your greenhouse all the time? Think about that, because darkness is critical going forward.
And also on that point, I mean, if you have any sort of lights in your propagation zone that you're finishing some poinsettias in, or for whatever reason that's doing night interruption, double check the timers.
Yes.
I had a grower, about a half acre a couple of years ago that they didn't realize. And by the time they did realize, it had already been a little bit past October. So they had lit them a little bit too long, even though they had sales up to Christmas. And unfortunately, there wasn't much they could do to catch up. They tried.
James, I would call that as our number one. It happens every year. So we're going to talk about certain aspects of this little exercise of poinsettia growing, and we'll point out some scenarios and problems and challenges that we run across in the support role. And inevitably, there is that I left my lights on, and it happens every year. Somebody.
And it's something as silly as a parking light pointed the wrong way in a parking lot. Yep. Bleeding into the greenhouse instead of out. It's those little things that you aren't much of an issue with most crops.
But I think you nailed it on the head. If you have lights and you are manipulating lights for any other crop throughout the season, even in proximity of this greenhouse, it doesn't even have to be in this greenhouse. Make sure those timers are off. Make sure that there is no light in the greenhouse at night. Don't assume. You will pay dearly for that one. So let's talk about temperatures. So early on, when we're talking about temperatures, we were basically talking about sort of a war with heat in the early stages, overheating and propagation, a common challenge, overheating around the pinch and all that. Now we're going to start talking about, we are still in some markets, a little bit of a battle with heat, and that will continue in some places in the Southwest, Southeast for another month or so. But in other people, now it's more about making sure that you're maintaining your temperatures. And yes, cool nights are nice, but there are limits in a poinsettia. And we'll talk a lot about cold finish here in a little bit, and we'll kind of get into the rules of engagement and some of the challenges associated with it. But one of the key things you got to keep in mind is ADT, average daily temperature. That's how a lot of ways the poinsettia's growth rate will be governed by this average daily temperature. Now, extreme heat during the middle of the day will slow down and stall and stress a poinsettia, as well very much cold at night. So you would say the AGT is critical, but extremes above the AGT in the heat of the day and then a night that gets too cold, they will have a negative effect relative to the average temperature. But what does a poinsettia really want? I mean, I think a poinsettia is about as happy as it can be in the mid 70s. You get a rapid growth rate. You can get up into the 80s and probably get more growth out of it, but I would argue that growth, the tone of that growth isn't ideal. So you're at 85, you're beginning to fight the growth a little bit. But when it comes to building a Bract, is where we're coming here later to the end, temperature is critical for Bract development. And there's some critical touches here, and this is one of those, it happens every year again, and that is night temperatures getting too hot. If you are in the deep south, be cognizant of that there are genetics that will perform with the night temperatures and initiate flower with night temperatures warm, but there are limited genetics. Other varieties, when the nights get above 75 or 78 degrees, especially for several nights in a row, which is a very common event in places like East Texas, the Gulf Coast, etc. That will begin to delay the flowering. And so there is it's called heat delay response to poinsettia. So you need to be aware of that and know that your night temperature is important. So the idea, well, I need to keep my heat up by day because I'm worried about the nights are starting to cool off a little bit. That's great. But also if your nights are retaining heat, make sure that you don't go into a save my vents mode. I'm gonna carry heat through the night mode when you're warm at night, because you need to get that early evening ventilation to get that temperature of the greenhouse down. Because even though it might be 77 outside, you might retain 80, 81 in the greenhouse just from latent heat into the evening. So really important to avoid that hot night during this initiation phase. The rules of engagement for this temperature pretty much apply to the same things that we talk about with the light, from really beginning of September through the middle of October. It can still influence. The later you go, the safer you are. But of course, Mother Nature cooperates and you're not fighting the heat. So it's really important. Maximum Bract development is in the mid 70s. An ideal for Bract development would be like a 75 ADT for Bract development. Overall growth for maximizing quality of growth, an ADT 68 to 73, that's relatively low. That means you can apply night temperatures down in the low mid 60s. So we'll get more into that here in a minute. So temperature is it's a very key part. Light, quality, and temperature are probably one of the two key factors that affect Bract development. That's why you find that there's some varieties that are really better suited for different regions, and varieties that are really work good in the north, where the day length gets very, very short, and our light levels, our ADT, or our moles, light moles drop dramatically. Varieties that are selected in those environments tend to work better in those environments. So here you can see is an example of a variety, and this is 3 different temperature regimes that we run through to test cold sensitivities in a variety. These are basically, this is a night temperature run from October to finish. And so you can see 55-degree nights is too cold, and you start to tie up nutrients and the bracts don't develop it. Even at this particular variety, at 60-degree nights, you're seeing some sensitivity, but at 66-degree nights, you get a decent Bract size. So what it really boils down to is you need to qualify your genetics on their night temperature sensitivity, or their temperature sensitivity to Bract development. So when you start talking about a cold finish strategy or cool night finish strategy, you really have to be cognizant of how your varieties work in this situation. Most catalogs out today will qualify and notate the varieties that are effective in this cool growing regime. Light levels, again, we talked about light pollution, but we also want to talk about light levels. In the beginning, when we're fighting stress and we're worried about the infrared heat gained from the sun and not heating and overheating the plant, because leaf temperature, the plant temperature is the key, not necessarily the air temperature. So in those situations, we talk about applying shade and all that. As we get around the corner, as the weather starts to turn and fall starts to hit, in most markets, you want to make sure that you're removing any shade. You want to make sure that you're maximizing the amount of light you can get, because as you get to the finishing phase, light quality, and in a lot of respects, quantity, will determine how well your bracts will develop. So it's really important that you shift your thinking from I'm worried about infrared heat from too much light to, again, this doesn't apply necessarily this early in the South, and in some cases it doesn't apply at all in the South, in extreme cases. But for the rest of the country and the rest of the markets, you have to start thinking about, I need to maximize my light at finish, because we're weaning it. Southern Hemisphere, different rules, obviously.
Yeah, in North America, you definitely want to make sure, look at your forecast before you take off some fixed shade, because you're going to get a little bit of stress on your plants as they climatize to that higher light level. So before you remove shade, ideally try and get a couple cloudy days in there. That way they can kind of build up to that light level of full intensity. Otherwise, we don't want to, if you see that all of a sudden you're going to have 85 degrees, that's atypical for your area, maybe leave the shade on for another week and then wait till it cools down. This is the games that we play in September.
I see a lot of growers will, especially like a direct stick scenario, will put 2 layers of shade over the house. And then as they begin to progress and the plants root out, and then they get the pinch on it, and they begin to break through the pinch and the breaks form, then they peel off that first layer of shade. And then the final layer of shade comes off as the weather starts to wane and the days get shorter. But yeah, again, that's a very good point, James. You don't want to shock the plant, especially if you're in a glass greenhouse. You could definitely get scalded. And at that point in the game, if we start talking about now and beyond, everything that happens on the leaf from today forward will be visible in the end. So anything that we do as far as sprays and irrigations and feeds and light manipulation and stresses, anything that will damage a leaf will now show in the end. Before, a lot of this stuff could get hidden, but now everything's going to be visible.
We talk a lot about Bract temperature for expansion and color retention and development. A lot of greenhouse operations in North America right now have infrared thermometers before you walk in. So that infrared thermometer will work the same on that Bract. All right. And on a sunny day, you should know the difference, or at least have an understanding of the difference of the Bract temperature versus your air temperature.
And the thing that's very telling about that is that what you run into is it really becomes a temperature/humidity scenario, because in very dry climates, that the evaporation from the soil and the transpiration from the surface of the leaf and the Bract is such that it actually self-cools itself. But when you're in that worst case scenario where the humidity is really high and you're still warm, that's when you start to run into that the challenge. It's the transpiration stream you're slowing down with humidity, and then the stress, and then the stress gets you.
And talk about that sort of typical high humidity stall that you see from the lack of transpiration.
Yeah, so one thing is I travel a lot. One of the most amazing things that I see year in and year out is the dramatic difference between how poinsettias grow in hot climates, depending on whether you're in a southwest dry hot climate versus a southeast humid hot climate. It is a night and day difference. I think it's true for most species, but in poinsettias, it is unbelievably different in how that response to the plant is. So something to keep an eye on. Speaking of humidity, so again, we wanted humidity is our friend in propagation. It keeps the stress off. It's our friend post pinch, and it keeps those new shoots young and herbaceous and tender. But in the end, it's our enemy. Humidity is not your friend in the end. Humidity can bring you lots of problems. It can bring you what we just talked about, is reduced transpiration, inhibition of moving heavy cations into the plant, iron, calcium, magnesium, all limited by limited transpiration. They really depend on that pump to really move themselves effectively to the top of the plant. So humidity becomes the enemy of transpiration. Humidity also becomes the friend of pathogens and all kinds of other nasty things that can happen. So again, we have these periods in the cycle of poinsettia production where humidity is an important piece of the puzzle. But when we start talking about from now to the end, if you're pinched and your breaks are established and they're at least like an inch long, now you start thinking about what is a low humidity strategy. So now humidity needs to go away. So humidity control, there's multiple ways to do dehumidification. There's, if you have environment computers, depending on the nature and your flavor of computer system, there are multiple ways to approach this. Whether you're talking about a maintained contiguous vent, a purge process where you purge, you blow humidity and heat out, and then close and warm up the drier, cooler air. I mean, it all goes back to the principle, and we'll get to that here in a bit, of one of my favorite topics is dew point. But we'll get to that point. But this picture here is exactly what you never want to see on a poinsettia crop unless you are propagating or you just pinched. That is fog in the greenhouse. Fog in the greenhouse is your enemy. It brings botrytis, it brings mildew. So it's very important to keep a close monitor on this. If you don't have automatic controls for your dehumidification of the greenhouse, that I would encourage you to do a afternoon aggressive ventilation going into the evening to purge the moist, warm air that has been built up by evapotranspiration in the greenhouse. Replace it with cooler air outside before you go into closed up for the night mode. But again, depending on your environment controls, and that's something that we can engage you guys, you know, if you have questions on this, because it can be complicated depending on your facility, but a critical piece of the puzzle. Hit your ADT targets. Make sure that you don't go too hot or too cold in your night temperatures. It's easy to not turn your heat on. An unnamed large growing operation who had to literally get email permission from an accountant before they could turn the heat on in the greenhouse. I finally convinced them to do that with a digital thermometer photograph of a 47-degree Bract. And then they got to turn the heat on. Struggled to finish the crop clearly, obviously. So it's important that we do not allow our want to save money mindset to go too far down the rabbit hole with poinsettias, and then also watch our high net temperatures. HEF is great if you got it. Exchange air. James?
Yeah, same thing. I mean, if you're rocking and rolling, and especially at the blush period, it is not a time to start turning down the temperatures at your night times to reduce your ADTs. That's a good way to stall development. All right. And
yeah, what you know, we're going to talk about cold finish, and that's exactly what you have to be wary of, is where's the line in the sand you can go with a given variety where you crash into that point, James, which is the lack of Bract development. And you also start crashing into my other favorite issue, which is dew point, yep. which will bring Bract edge burn, which will bring botrytis, which will bring blah, blah, blah. All of this other stuff comes with that. Dew point equals low transpiration, which equals nutritional problems as well as disease problems. So it's a very good point, James. So cool finish. So I alluded to that earlier. So what is cool finish? This is a strategy that's done a lot, and we do it a lot just to reduce our energy costs, and is applicable on poinsettias. It was a big issue in North America back a while back when the natural gas prices were higher. But it's a very big issue in Europe for a lot of parts of the continent don't have natural gas as a resource. So if you do want to talk about reducing your energy input, you can use a cool finish strategy. So what does that mean? It really is talking about reducing the night temperatures in the later part of the production, basically October, November. It's very important that you know exactly how to do this. With this comes some pitfalls, and that's what we're going to talk about, is what you got to know to pull it off. So you got to know your scheduling. You have to establish early growth. If you're going to go into October and November and finish with a cool night, you're going to slow down the growth. That means if you're looking at sort of a growth curve mindset for where you would be in a traditional night temperature finishing, you need to be above the graph. In other words, you need to build the plants more before you cool them off. So that is about scheduling. You might need to add a week of pinch between pinch and initiation to get that extra size on that plant, or just add a week period. There's no way to look at it. you want to take advantage. To do it well, you work and flex a bit with the environment that is in front of you. So when I use the term, and I use this across multiple crops. It's very critical in things like osteo and carnation production. We're doing very cold finish. It's called, the concept is called running with the sun. And the idea is keep your heat set points lower, but don't necessarily keep your daytime cooling set points too low, because if it's going to warm up in October, November, it's probably because the sun's shining and you want to take advantage of that sun for your Bract development. So when you're finishing a poinsettia in cool finish, take advantage of what you can get from the sun. But again, be careful how you apply that, and we'll get into that, because you hold too much heat in the day, you have struggle with dew point with the cool night. So we'll get to there.
Also, depending on your variety, that you're using, you might not, if you have a variety that's finishing mid-December, which is more of a 9.5 week, cool finish might not be a good option for that variety, because you're going to cool it down and slow it down, and it takes longer to develop anyway, right?
Absolutely, and that's one of the critical reasons why at Selecta we do these cool environment trials. We grow in very cool environments because we want to know the genetics that are going to be sensitive and are going to not develop. And we find that cool screen also provides us not just cool screen, but there's a nice correlation with light level reduction as well. So varieties that tend to finish cool and still maintain the Bract development tend to work better in reduced light climates in the far north. So it's a good exercise. But yes, got to pay attention to your varieties. There was a lot, and I'll show you some pictures that'll point that out clear as bell. There are varieties that cannot work, period. Cannot work, will not work. That you have to know. Managing your diff, that's the thing, because you are going to make a potentially positive diff environment, which could accelerate growth. You just need to realize that you might be applying a temperature regime that might cause a little stretch. But again, that's only if your night temperatures are a little bit on the higher side. With a real true cool night, that cooling effect kind of overrides the positive diff you would get. Walk before you run. Practice, learn what you're doing. So it's best with reds. It's best with any saturated color, reds or saturated color novelties. The reason being is whites tend to go creamy or green in the cool night. So to really get a white to be white, you want to finish it relatively warm. So white in a cool regime, even though the Bracts may develop on a given variety, they're going to lean to whatever underlying color is under there. I call them the green whites and the beige whites, and it really depends on the parentage. So whatever that shift from pure white is in the genetic will be exaggerated by a cool night. I will say, however, and I wouldn't want to stand on this as an action, but this new variety, Alaska, which is a very white variety, even though it does reduce the Bract size a little bit, it did way better than I thought in a cool night. So it's worth looking at new whites in a cool night situation, but historically, whites are challenging, not because of development, but because of color shift. That's true of other light novelties as well. The colors are going to be more intense.
Yeah, at this moment with the new whites, I mean, they're so bright paper white that it's more of a trial phase for the cooler nights at this point. Absolutely. Than running with it, because you spend the money and you shift your production to these newer whites and then you finish them cool. Well, you haven't really accomplished anything because that brightness isn't coming through.
Exactly. And my experience with this, with them in a cool environment is Europe based, and it's based on a couple of different trial locations. And, one read is not enough to make a recommendation. So definitely pay attention to it. Again, reds are the best to do, and there are a lot of good reds that are very good at cool finish, and red is usually the majority of your production. So the idea is I'll keep my whites and my novelties and my maybe low short growing novelties or any of these other idiosyncrasies that you have. I'll put them in a normal greenhouse, but I'll put my reds, I'll pick reds that are cool tolerant, and I'll put my large production runs into their own cooling zone. There are other factors. You are, with genetics, there's going to be delay. In some cases, it's minimal. I mean, a day or two. Other cases, it's a week. Some cases, it's fatal. It's just won't work. Bract size reduction is the same thing with delay. You have some varieties that they reduce a little bit. Everybody will reduce a little bit, but a lot of varieties will produce still a very attractive, saleable plant. In some cases, I think an improved look on the plant with a little bit of a cool night. But there are other varieties that just absolutely will not work. They will not. The Bracts will not size up. You are creating a environment which is good for botrytis and mildew. You are also potentially, if you're not careful, reducing ADT, reducing your ability to uptake nutrients in that plant during the day. So you got to be careful how you do it. So again, that's a subtle change, but it does affect it a little bit.
And so if you're finishing cooler, while you can reduce your EC as you get closer to finish, you might need to adjust your feed higher so you don't your EC doesn't crash hard as you're cooling off temperature.
So this is a good example of two varieties. All three of these are commercial varieties. Two varieties that will not work in a cold finish and one that does work in a cold finish. And this was basically like a 58-degree night regime where this happened. So it's really important that you know the varieties will work. Check references in your catalogs for cool capabilities, or ask somebody. Because again, trying to cool off the wrong variety, it just won't work. So my point here is that there are genetics that are good for this and genetics that aren't in everybody's programs. So be aware of that.
We had something come through the Q&A, which I think is a new problem that we've created ourselves, Gary. What about SkyStar? Where does that fit in for the cool finish?
Yes.
I think that would be a good example of one that we don't want to cool off too early because it's already a late finish.
Yeah.
But to get its spots, once you do have the Bract development, that's when I would turn off the temperature and cool it down so you get the starring effect on your red Bract.
Yeah, I agree. We have a lot of work to do before we know exactly what to make this thing tick, but it's certainly a gorgeous thing when it works. So we gotta solve that one. But yeah, I agree. I think that could be a serious temperature conundrum that we're gonna have to deal with relative to anything else that's growing in the range.
I mean, it's a good example of the one that I said, you don't want to finish a late variety and turn it down too quickly, right?
Exactly
and
right.
It naturally is going to come in first week of December at its best and its peak. And later, it might not finish to December 7th. And the best starring I saw last year really didn't come in until after December 10th.
No, I would agree. Yeah, I would say early December. It depends on the climate in the South. Specifically, like not the South, but just a higher light environment, brighter environments. You do see it about early December, 1st of December, but in a lot of climates without blackout, you're going to see it late. Really like December 10th. So anyway, back to challenge with the cool night, cool finish. Height management, for sure. Like I said, you got to build the plant first because you're going to reduce your growth a bit. Dew point is a big issue. Nutrition is something you're going to have to deal with. Any of your high pH sensitivities, especially to magnesium, get exacerbated with cool temperatures, as those heavy cations just don't move freely through the transpiration stream because you're lowering the transpiration stream. So just keep that in mind. Pythium is an issue. It likes the cooler temperatures. So if you have active Pythium and you're doing a cool finish, then it will help the Pythium to progress. If you don't have Pythium, it's not a factor, but something to watch. Again, we showed that picture of the dramatic delay in Bract production. And the other thing is if you get too far down that rabbit hole and it's droops, or we call it epinasty, which really you got to get really cold to pull that off. Most modern poinsettias won't show that in any kind of temperatures we're talking about for cool finish. So let's talk about dew point. I hit this on the last one, but I'm going to hit this again. Simple principle, guys. I would call this judge a grower with how good are they as a professional grower. Two questions I will ask a grower, regardless of the crop. Do you understand what dew point is and how it happens? Second question will be, do you understand the difference between alkalinity and pH? If a grower can answer those two questions, then the grower shows that's the grower that I think is seriously in the game. If you can't answer those questions, then you need to figure out how to learn those principles because they're really important. Dew point follows a simple rule. When there is dew in the greenhouse, whether you see it on the leaf or not, you're creating an environment for spores to germinate. Botrytis and powdery mildew, in particular in the poinsettia crop, are happy and content when there is this, even if it's not a visible fog in the greenhouse or visible dew on the surface of the plant. But dew point is that point with which the air can no longer hold its water and it begins to condense out. How dew point occurs is a basic simple principle, and that's relative humidity. And the term relative is paramount. Warm air holds more water than cool air. So when you leave in greenhouse terms, you have a nice warm slug of moist air in the greenhouse in the afternoon. Now let's talk in terms of cold finish. Now I'm going to turn my heat off and set it down to 60 degrees. So let's look at this little graph here. And you can see what happens is if the temperature outside is 75 degrees, and 75% relative humidity, which is not unheard of in the afternoon on a nice warm growing day in October, my dew point now is at 68 degrees. That means if I try to do a cool finish, or frankly, any finish temperature in the 60s, I am going to have a problem with dew point because our relative humidity was too high in that air block that is held in the greenhouse. So that's where dehumidification comes into play. Now, if you look, if you have the same temperature, 75 degrees, but I've now purged that relative humidity in the afternoon, and I'm going into the evening at 60%, my dew point is 63.3. Better, but not good enough for a cold finish. There's the rub. Even if I drop my humidity down to 60 degrees, my dew point's at 63.3. But what's important to look at this third graphic is the relative relevance of temperature in the weight of the influence. So in other words, by dropping the temperature from 75 to 68 and leaving the relative humidity at 75, my dew point drops all the way down to 61.6. So what that's telling you is the way to mitigate and to lower your dew point in the greenhouse is to effectively cool the air off before you close it up. Or if you have the environment controls, when you're doing this night cooling phase, set a absolute or a relative humidity target and a purge strategy to make sure that you're peeling off that humidity as it begins to climb towards dew point. Okay, so I'm off my soapbox. I apologize for that one, but that one gets every crop in the greenhouse all year long. We deal with this issue.
I mean, but it is a issue that I think people kind of know that whites are more susceptible to botrytis. But if you're creating dew point with your cooler finish and making your bracts a little bit creamy, then at the same time you're going to have that pressure from the botrytis.
And you get there's that late botrytis we call pinpoint, which is basically, it manifests itself as like little brown or dark flecks all over the surface of the bracts. It's usually most pronounced on whites. And imagine what happens is you have a brief moment of dew, long enough for that botrytis spore to germinate, but then it dries off and that bract's up in the top of the plant, so it's a dry enough environment that botrytis doesn't progress. But you had enough of a window of dew for that spore to germinate and create that micro infection, which is about the size, like 1/16 of an inch or less in diameter. So again, you got to be careful with dew point on a poinsettia, big time. Cold sensitivity, again, you can see, know your varieties. It's just really important, know your varieties. A lot of varieties don't work. Whites are a challenge. You can see here, this is a normally very, very white, commercial white, that up until a couple of years ago was considered one of the most white, but you can see here in this situation, it's not white. So again, be careful of your whites in the cool finish. James, I'm done. I'm gonna drink some water. You take over.
Yeah. Well, give me some. You still have to run the PowerPoint, so don't take off too quickly on me, okay?
No, I'm not.
Moisture management's do and don't. Basically, poinsettias, just like through the pinch and after the pinch, we're keeping and targeting even moisture. All right. We want to be in the middle of the road. All right. We want to protect our roots. And if we can, we want to do preventatives in a timely manner so we can increase and enhance that root life and shelf life. This is a crop that is going to be in this pot roughly for 4 to 5 months while it's in your possession in the greenhouse. So in that time, you can have EC buildup or phantom EC, which is the hardest to diagnose, where it's like, okay, I have an EC of 1, which is respectable, right? It's not too bad. But most of that 1 is in sodium and chlorine, 2 common things that are left over out of most fertilizers. So the plant's going to show you that it's kind of nutritionally deficient, right? But your EC is okay. Well, that's, when in doubt, leach it out and just put in a high rate of feed coming back in it. All right?
Sodium is a bigger problem in poinsettias than a lot of people give it credit to. Not only does it build and build EC and sensitivity to the roots, but it's antagonistic. It's antagonistic against some other elements going to the plant. So,
and your moisture management will be one of your biggest contributors to humidity within your greenhouse as you hit November. All right. When you don't have a sun to really drive that transpiration, or you have a bunch of cloudy days strung together, timing and how much water that you apply to the crop and how you apply that water to the crop is, I think, as a former grower, your most important decisions at that time of year.
Agreed. You need to know what the roots want. Poinsettias grow from the bottom up, and a happy root is a happy poinsettia. Now, sometimes a happy root means a poinsettia that's ahead of schedule because you weren't ready for a happy root and you now have a PGR battle on your hand. But nonetheless, it's going to be a much stronger plant with a good root under it.
As usual, we're avoiding dry. I think I hit all the rest of the other stuff to avoid in that.
Yeah, cycling dry, that's a biggie. Cycling dry equals pithy.
Yeah, and look, for your growers that are out there, you might have a primary water system. Again, I'm talking about November. It's 3 days of clouds coming in. You have your outside and your corners are a little bit dry, but you have this big, perfect drip irrigation system. Your centers are wet. It's going to be cloudy for another 2 or 3 days. The centers are going to be wet and they're going to leach out water onto the ground. That's when you, unfortunately, have to pull a hose and just, go underneath the foliage and just go with a little bit of clear water to touch up. All right. And just get your medium moisture through. Or worst case scenario, you got to water and all you have is flood floors. Well, that's a situation where you want to make sure you get those flood floors and you flood as early as possible. So during the day, you're not having that residual humidity build up or possibly can purge out that humidity during the day while you're at work.
Yep.
Continue to monitor your pH and your EC. For pH, you're monitoring, you want to target a 5.9 and to a 6.6. But as you get later into that November stage, a 6.8 and a 7 isn't as concerning as a 6.8 and a 7 currently, right? And your pH is going to raise naturally in the cycle and go closer to that 7. And while you can reduce after you've got your Bract development and your coloration, you can reduce your fertilizer. Don't completely stop fertilizing. We don't want these. That's a situation where you can you pulled back the fertilizer, and right as you're going to ship, you pulled it back real hard, and they start pulling all that nitrogen from your lower leaves. And now you got to go through, and as you put on your pot covers, take out 4 or 5 yellow leaves, and you're just destroying the efficiency of your picking crews.
Weakens the roots as well.
Yep.
Oops, sorry, I have a mouse sleeping momentum.
Oh, no problem. So we have just a typical kind of finishing a pH and EC monitoring by week here. You can see that as there's an inverse relationship between the pH and the EC, meaning that as your pH increases, your EC will decrease, and conversely, as your EC increases, your pH will decrease. So, that's why we typically will see as you back off your EC, you're just holding the plants, a 7.2 is not so much of an issue, right? But if you're in mid-October and you're clocking pHs that are 7.5, then your EC is more than likely low, and I would say that your plants are starving themselves, and you're going to get in that situation with the lower leaf yellowing and weakened roots.
Magnesium will rear its head. That's where I think it's the pH is critical up until pretty much the third week of October, as you're developing the bracts, because if you can't move enough magnesium up through the roots, those bracts will steal it from the leaf right below, and it'll show itself.
This is just calling out that inverse relationship, on 36 with a 5.7 and a higher EC at a 1.6.
And I think you could argue the different feeds would affect that differently as the feed influences in the EC, but I think it's a general principle is that the message here is watch this. If you're feeding aggressively, a low EC and a modest pH is alignment. But if you're not feeding enough, a low CE and a rising pH is a good indication that you're not feeding enough. So if the plant is healthy and happy, you can get away with a low EC reading because the plant's taking it all up. But your pH will be more happy. But if you get into a situation where the EC is really low and the pH is starting to climb, that shows me that you have a trend of underfeeding. And
actually, this is kind of with the good temperatures that we're seeing around there, at least east of the Mississippi. That's what I'm seeing out in the marketplace, where we have unusually low EC, and it's just because, and they're feeding very well. They're 150 plus on their ppms and nitrogen that they're feeding, which I wouldn't say is low at this time. And, which is showing up in the tests that we're at a 0.7, 0.8 on the EC. And I would argue that more than likely, because you're showing a little bit yellow leaves, that EC is unusable or useless elements that's making up that 0.7 for you. Right?
It's where flood floor is such a tricky game. A flood floor without the capability of leaching is scary. You're playing a very fine balancing act from going too lean to too hot, and you're playing around with pH as well. So flood floors are a little bit of a different game, a little higher level game, I would say. So we were talking about magnesium. So here you go, James.
Yeah, we got some magnesium deficiency. So again, avoid your high pH, because when you have your high pH, your available magnesium is going to be harder for the plant to uptake and translocate. So this is, some examples of what you're seeing as you're kind of growing your crop that would trigger you to think, oh man, right now maybe my pH is a little wonky. All right.
It's a classic scenario in October when you start to see transitions, to start to see this innovative chlorosis, typically 1 or 2 leaves right below the turning bract. Now it's important to watch because it's tricky, because in some cases in reds, this will kind of look like a transition bract. But you have to recognize this is clearly intervenal, and it's going to be a little bit below where the bracts are. It's treatable if you catch it early, but if you don't treat it, that leaf is going to be permanently yellowed.
Yeah, and it'll stall the rest of the growth as far as your bract development.
Like I said, even if you correct it in the plant, it's going to be almost impossible to correct it in that leaf if you get like into early November, because that leaf is pretty much done and all the nutrition is roaring right up to the top.
Yeah, that leaf is a sink, right? It's not taking in new nutrition. It's just extra. So
it's just extra, right? And so to move that, you have to move that nutrient in there. So again, this is magnesium deficiency. What James was talking about, that early October pH and low EC. This is one of the problems you'd run into in those, going from September to November window, late September through mid part of October. Low EC, especially if the pH is climbing, this is going to be one of your common results, especially on the darker red colors.
nitrogen deficiency, classic. You know, you just turned down. We conserved our feed a little too early, right? And typically this will show up even in the growing tips or the higher point leaves, right, up in the plant.
At the end. I think that's one of the reasons why this picture was important. And I talked to the gentleman, a Italian researcher that took this photograph, and I said, that almost looks like magnesium. And he says, that is a poinsettia that's starved at the very end. He says, what's happening is I said, well, why isn't it the bottom leaves turning yellow? He says, because the plant's only working at the top. Though it looks like it's a heavy cation deficiency, because the plant is stealing it from the closest leaves. So that is basically the look of I'm not feeding enough in the end. Whereas the magnesium has a much more specific interchlorosis look. But that was a fun conversation with the researcher that did this, and how we achieved that look with nitrogen. And that is basically, he says, I stopped feeding him nitrogen in the end of October and none through November, 0 in the feed. And this is what you get.
Yeah, nitrogen, just from a basic biology level, you're developing new cells. Nitrogen's the primary thing. Plants need it, so keep feeding it on there. Calcium deficiency is another one, and this is, the classic, Bract edge burn, where the newer genetics, typically, if you're feeding a good balanced feed of a 17-5-17 with calcium, you don't need to apply as regularly any additional calcium overhead. As growers, we always like insurance. We only have one shot for this, so I would never tell a grower not to spray calcium on anything, because if it makes you feel better and sleep better at night, hey, do it, because you only have one shot at this.
I would agree. I think the calcium scenario is tied to a specific set of environments, basically dirt floor type environments, even if on benches. But really what it goes back to what we talked about earlier is that transpiration stream. It's the humidity, light challenge. Without transpiration, these heavy cations don't move up to the tops. So I would say, it's an insurance policy to apply a calcium.
And these bracts are special, right? They're not true leaves, so their rates of transpiration, even in the bracts, are reduced.
Yep.
Right. So if you have a high humidity around the bracts, not only do you have a potential disease situation, you have reduced calcium going into that bract, which can lead to this burn.
And I think you just hit something that's a very important point that we didn't hit earlier. And you said the high humidity around this bract. And that is so important to realize, is that by the time the bracts are forming, you've created a closed canopy or a near closed canopy. You've created microclimate. And there tends to be a humid bubble around that plant. Unless you have a lot of HAF moving, your humidity is going to be worse there on the bract than what you see out on a sensor.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, we talk a lot about climate and climate control, but in a plant, in a nice picture like this here, you have the top microclimate, and then you have the dense canopy, and you have two different kind of microclimates in an individual large pot, and then you have the greater climate of the whole greenhouse and the crop itself. This is a picture I think that everybody should screenshot just for reference. That you have it on your phone. It's a wonderful kind of, what is my poinsettia doing deficiency sort of model here. And we were lucky enough to, borrow this from an Italian researcher that Gary is buddies with. But, you're going to see that what we've talked about, the calcium deficiency, the boron deficiency, and the top parts of the plant and the leaves and the bract. Then we have in the middle of it, we have more of our magnesium and our copper deficiency, which can, in the mid ground. And then in your dead middle, you're having your iron, manganese, and zinc, more of your metals, right? And then at the bottom is typically where you're going to see your nitrogen deficiency, your phosphorus deficiency, and your potassium deficiencies. But you can also at your bottom get your toxicities, right? So on your boron and your manganese.
And just for reference, poinsettias, like a lot of crops, can be sensitive to low pH and an aggressively minor package, and you end up with iron manganese toxicity on poinsettia. So that can happen like you see on a geranium or marigold. It can happen if your pH is really low. And I saw some pretty good examples of it this year where lime system failed. And you can see it clear as bell. You know, pH is below 5. It's clear. It's very, very distinct.
Interesting point that you brought up with the lime system failure. We have a lot of people that are using newer medias, right? And some of those medias have different buffering capacities. I know I've gotten a couple questions of people, for example, using a higher pine tree substrate or hydrofiber rate, typical. So keep in mind that you're reducing your buffering capacity when you increase that sort of percentage and relative to the amount of peat that you have in your media. And therefore you can have a little bit wider range of swings in your pH up and down.
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of notate that we've kind of become peat-like people just because it's the resource we had and it's what we chose, and we built our nutrition regimes around it. But we've always been you know, blessed with the fact that peat is very acidic, and we've had to put a fair amount of lime, calcium and magnesium, limestones into these, you know, dolomite and such into the media to compensate for that buffering of acidity. But it's also been a really nice slow release source of calcium and magnesium for us. As we go into these more neutral components, we've lost the buffering capacity of the peat to keep the pH down. We're putting less lime in because of that. So there's less calcium and magnesium in the soil. So we have to make sure that we have plenty of calcium and magnesium in our liquid feed regime. But guess what? They tend to push the pH up. So it forces you, it's not undoable by any means. Don't get me wrong, it's great products. But it makes you rethink. You got to rethink how you structure and organize your feed regime based on the fact that you have a very different chemistry in that medium.
A lot of poinsettias are very specially
gorgeous stuff. I mean, don't get
in
me
the
wrong.
new medias. I do have to, you know, say that I've seen more successful people be at somewhere in the range between a 30 and a 40%. As we get higher from 40%, that reduced buffering capacity becomes more nuanced for the growers to monitor.
We went through the same exercise when we start bringing core into the conversation. When you start bringing the same scenario, it changes the chemistry effectively.
Combating Bract edge burn, you know, lack of calcium connected to the Bract edge burn. Again, transpiration connected to the humidity that we have and the microclimate around the Bract, and make sure that you have a fertilizer that has all these balanced feeds in them. And many growers are utilize a calcium chloride spray in mid to late October, somewhere between, you know, 200 to 400. I've seen as high as 600 to 800. Maybe a little bit unnecessary, but it depends on also what your source of calcium is, right? If you have something that's less refined, then you're not using the laboratory grade stuff, then you're going to spray a higher ppm to get a higher active amount of calcium on that Bract. And that's where chelates kind of fall into the system, right? You know, if you're spraying a chelate, you're going to have a little bit more of a active calcium going directly into the tissue where it's needed most, right? So you don't, in a high humidity environment, it's a good way to cheat to make sure you're getting your calcium, because you can't rely solely on your transpiration.
No, I would agree. Chelates are a great tool, without question. I'm a huge fan. Okay, James, we're kind of running slow, so let's kind of move quickly through the fun stuff, the disease and the bugs.
All the fun diseases we can kind of breeze through. Not really. So this is very similar. I think we've seen some of these things already. Rhizoctonia, you're attacking right above the soil line. Diagnosis Pythium, unfortunately, right? A few options there for your sort of use to kind of combat something that you see on Rhizoctonia. You don't necessarily need to have the webbing, right? So don't rule out Rhizoctonia because you don't have the webbing.
Usually, I was going to say, Rhizoc's usually an earlier disease associated around the soil line. We don't see it a lot late, but it can flare its head late.
Yeah, and see, this is something that I see a little bit more commonly is botrytis on the stem, higher in that dense canopy, taking out a whole branch. If you start to see one branch of a multi-stem pot that's drooping and going down, follow it back to the source. Either it's broken, right, from handling or something of the sort, or you have what unfortunately would be botrytis, right? And to get something into that canopy, you're looking at a heavy spray, or more of what we would typically call or refer to as a sprench. At the same time, here's this last part. The most important thing with anything that you're applying, whether it be an insecticide or a pesticide, is Bract safety, right? So make sure that you're referencing something that is safe on Bracts. Or if it's a newer product, our friends at OHP had a couple new products for insecticides that could be used for whitefly. Try it out first, all right? Especially for something that's released in the current year. Try it out on a few plants, sacrifice some things just to further the knowledge.
I think one of the things that I see people using is using products like Medallion or Pageant, and they're doing an earlier heavy application prior to Bract development in that plant in an attempt to protect the stems. And they're just banking on the residual protection on the stems before coloration. So they just basically prophylactically go out there and on principle and do a botrytis treatment, third week in October, and a heavy one. And just to try to, again, carry it over, because to James's point is once they turn red, there's less things you can apply safely and effectively. And the canopy, the more the canopy is closed, the harder it is to get it down in there. And there is nothing that translocates downward in the plant. You have things that will be upward systemic, but not downward systemic. So again, that's why I think a lot of the guys have gone to, well, I'm going to assume I'm going to be in this battle in the end, and I'm going to go treat it before I run into the risks. Everybody's favorite.
Yeah, favorite Pythium. I know that we've been kind of going over every life stage, how fungus gnats typically not, unless if you're out of propagation, not insect number one, right? But with poinsettias, every life stage, it would be your number one or number two insect.
Call it number one. Today, with the tools in our arsenal, I would say I see more damage, unsaleable poinsettias due to Pythium than I do to whitefly.
And again, this Pythium could be a wet-dry cycle as well. Typically, where it happens is weekend waterers. So make sure that you have clear communication from somebody that's not normally taking over zones on a Thursday or a Friday before everybody breaks off, right? So they know exactly what's been going on with that moisture management strategy with that crop. And this becomes critically important as we have less days where we can physically irrigate.
So I think one of the things you have to keep in mind with Pythium as a good kind of way to diagnose why you have it is, I like to just take a plant that collapses and you believe it's Pythium and literally dissect it, take a knife and slice it right down the middle, right through the soil ball, right through the cutting, and splay it out and look at it. If the Pythium looks like it started from the outside and works its way towards the crown of the plant, where in other words, the roots are worse on the outer perimeters, that's usually an irrigation problem. You're cycling dry or you're sitting in a puddle. If it starts and the roots are malformed and brown in the center and you have some active roots on the outside, then in that dissection, you will most likely, 9 out of 10 times, you will see some evidence of fungus gnat feeding on the base of that cutting. Where the Pythium infection gets there, you stress the plant out with a drought event or whatever it is, and then the Pythium attacks. But usually if it's on the outside in, it's a direct answer to your irrigation practices, not a fungus
gnat. Powdery mildew. This is one that can really attack early on before we actually close the canopy as well. But every year we seem to see a little bit more powdery mildew. So just be aware of it. Still, I would say botrytis would be your number one culprit on the funguses, right? But powdery mildew is something to be aware of. And
on the top of the plant, yeah, I would say botrytis is number one on the top, Pythium number one on the bottom.
Yeah. And we have a nice chart in the back of our catalogs for poinsettias where we have some chemicals as well as biological bioinsecticides and stuff that are considered to be safe on Bract. So this is the point of the year where we start to really pay attention to the safe on Bract column. All right, and we also have this available digitally on our website, selecta1northamerica.com. Use the resources, and as newer products come to market and they have been trialed out and sufficiently enough to kind of make us feel comfortable to publish that, we add new things to the list.
And there are some new things that are being looked at that may bring more options to the table.
Fungus gnats and shortfly, just a little bit of a kind of refresher here on what you have when you're looking at the life cycles of a larvae, pupal, and nymph of a fungus gnat, and then a shortfly as well.
Again, as we talked about, feeding on the callus, feeding on that cutting.
Yep, feeding on the base.
Yep.
Again, you've had this crop for 4 or 5 months. This is where a little bit of nematodes can help you out along the way.
If you can keep the moisture and your soil up, nematodes are a wonderful thing. But if you dry out the soil, if you cycle dry, your nematodes die. So just keep that in mind. Cycle dry, nematodes die. So whitefly, yeah.
Whitefly, we have 2 different, biological, more biologicals are used for whitefly every year. This is one of the points where I like to kind of know what you have as far as your neighbor is concerned. Whitefly aren't exactly known to be the best flyers out there, even though they're called whitefly. But if you have, for example, soybeans, I would say are crop number 1 in my book, that if it's your neighbor next to your vent that's growing a crop of soybeans and goes through and starts to harvest, make sure you're paying attention, or, be good neighbors. Ask your farmer to give you a heads up. That way you can close some vents ahead of time. That way all that whitefly doesn't come right into your greenhouse.
I'd have to say up through cotton and strawberries on that list of neighboring crops to pay close attention to. And again, I think James has got a great point. Have a conversation with the farmer as to when he's going to harvest, or when he's going to spray down the cotton, or what he's going to be doing, so that you have some sense of how to manage the pressure, because you'll get these waves. I mean, an unbelievable waves of whitefly pouring into your greenhouse.
And typically those whiteflies are very easy to kill, right? Because they're outside. They're not the greenhouse that we're talking about, and it's not something that is generational within. This is where your monitoring program, whether at some point you should have sticky cards out there. You should be starting about now to kind of see what levels of whitefly you do have carrying into your later finishing of crop as we start to close in from outside vents, right, continuously, so we don't have that outside pressure coming into the greenhouse. And then also, take a look under and make sure you're identifying here between your greenhouse whitefly and I think you have a picture on the next one of your Bracemia, right? Your silver wing, which is not nearly as bad. Silver leaf, excuse me.
So now Bemisia is actually the worst one.
Oh, excuse me. Sorry about that.
Bemisia sweet potato whitefly is the one where you get the Q and B biotypes. So that's the one that can have the resistance pressure on it. So new chemistry seems to be working against Bemisia, but again, we've seen over the years past the Q biotypes get loose and really kind of explode. So it's important to know which one you're dealing with.
Yeah, and we do have newer chemicals to evaluate. It seems that Rycar has been very effective. I apologize to the people in New York because I don't think it's still allowed in certain parts of New York State to be used.
In Canada. Sorry, guys.
Yeah.
So anyway, just whitefly, you know what you got. There's a lot of good references out there. There's a lot of good support from the chemical industry about how to do this, from the biological industry. If you're going to go the bio route, definitely go with the professionals. Let them put a program together for you.
Yep, and some recommendations.
Don't break the rules.
Yeah, no.
So again, more charts.
More recommendations, more things that you can use.
Yeah. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about PGR here as it progresses to the end of the crop. Now, early on, we used PGR, and we talked about PGR as a tool in the liner in early stages to stack the internodes pre-pinch. We talked about using PGR post-pinch to basically scaffold and structure the plant and get it so that the bracts are all on top. And we've talked about PGR in the sort of early developmental growing stages. Now we're going to talk about PGR now and PGR in October. There is no conversation about PGR in November. So those people that want to whip out the fascination on November 5th, forget it. You're too late, you're going to ruin your crop. So if you needed to stretch, get your crop height, do it early. Know where you are and respond early. That's one of the first rules. But what we talk about right now is this is something that James and I agree on adamantly, is stop the B9 now. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that early on in a lot of markets, you use B9 cycocell tank mix in all of these early applications we referred to in propagation, in the post-pinch management, and the early growth development control. But what happens with B9 is it accumulates in the plant and it delays the plant. So repeat applications of B9. So if you're in the South and you're in Texas, and I know, I'm not going to name you, but I'm talking to you right now and you're listening. You have probably put on 4 B9 cycocells at this point. Stop now, because the B9 accumulates and it will cause delay. What you want to do now is you want to stick to a straight cycocell regime, or you start to begin the time window when the bonsai drench strategy comes into play. Now, and I'd love to hear you, James, your 2 cents on this one is, initially when the bonsai microdrench strategy came out of Barrett's work years ago, there was this fear factor about applications of this around initiation. And I know that when we were looking at bonsais, both as a drench and sprays, absolutely a spray around initiation was damn near fatal as far as delay. But do you think, James, because I am changing my take on this one, what's your take on early micro drench bonsai applications relative to initiation?
I'm not, we're not applying the chemical on the top of the plant here. We're trying to target and get it in the media. It's at a very low rate. I'm very anti-B9 at this time, right? Because of the issues that I've seen with it. So I got to allow something, right? And I can't say that bonsai has been an issue, right, around initiation from what I've seen.
I would say be careful the further north you go. I have worked with a lot of guys in the southern areas that over the years that we've just evolved this strategy. And I have to tell you, the only thing that you want to make sure you have done, in my opinion, before you start playing with micro drench rates of bonsai is that you've built the structure, the scaffold of the plant. You want the structure of the plant right so the branches are relatively even. You start a drench strategy too early, that you just kind of lock in the architecture. But beyond that, I don't think, as long as you're accurate, your rates are clear, there's nothing to worry about. And again, this is here's another, it happens every year. Micro drench, if you're going to use a micro drench on a bonsai, we're talking about rates that, a 10th of a part per million, a 20th of a part per million, maybe an 1/8 of a part per million. If you're aggressive in the deep south towards the end, maybe a 1/4, right? We're talking really, really low weights. Every year I get at least one call of, oh man, I really messed up. I thought I put a 1/10 of a part bonsai down, but I put a 1 part down. Now what? Don't do that.
On top of that, check your injection rate.
Yeah, I was going to say that's
because if it's not the decimal point that's messed up and in the wrong place, the injection rate with the injector that you're applying could be the source.
Absolutely. Right? You need to calibrate your injector before you start going nuts with drenches. We'll get into that. But again, I think what's important to understand, this is just a slide I've used before, but this is just important to recognize, is we're talking about how much efficacy there is in a 1/10 of a part bonsai drench. Single application on the plants on the right has massive amounts of effect. So again, these were built with straight up cycocell sprays But then the application of cyclocell spray and then being a bonsai drench of a tenth, you can see that the bonsai drench of a tenth, all things being equal, is way more efficacy than a single cyclocell spray application. So the point is bonsai is very, very active. It's very, very cost effective because you're putting ridiculously low rates on. So it's very cost effective. But you just got to be real careful and you got to do your math. It's Bob Vila, baby. Measure twice, cut once.
Yeah, and keep it simple. Cyclocell to shape your plant. Bonsai micro drenches to reduce overall growth. You can't go from and ignore the shaping of the plant. Otherwise, you're just going to have a smaller, reduced growth, pokey plant.
Yep. And the thing about bonsai is you think about it's a whole different strategy than I'm applying the spray. This is about how much chemical am I going to put in the soil relative to how much plant do I have to manage, right? Because the bonsai goes in the soil, it's not going anywhere. It doesn't leach out the bottom. It's in the soil and your plant's going to take it up. So how you apply the bonsai is a combination of the rate at which you apply it and then the volume of liquid that you apply. So we prefer a stabilized or a fixed volume drip emitter. I'm not talking about an old school drape and flood out the end emitter. I'm talking about a modern Netafim type. There's multiple versions of that. But either way, you want a controlled emitter, half gallon, 1 gallon per hour type of emitter. That will allow you to meter the application more evenly throughout the crop. If you're going to use drip tape, which is, I think, the most commonly used and is a great investment, by the way, you have to be cognizant that you can run it. In agriculture, they run it ridiculous lengths. And it works fine in a field crop situation at ridiculous lengths. But when you're talking about using it to apply something as sensitive like a PGR drench, where the volume per pot is very, very precise, you can do a couple of techniques. And this particular grower chose to move the header to the center of the house, so they had cut the distance in half. The other way you can do this, though, is reduce the rate by half, but increase the volume, because the lag time from the first drip to the one on the far end dripping is it's a matter of time. So if that lag is 25 seconds, 25 seconds on a 10-minute run of a 10th part per million versus 25 seconds on a 20-minute run of a 20th part per million as a fraction is much, much less. So it allows you to mitigate the evenness. The other thing that comes into play that really plays in your favor on long drip runs is the ones in the back are going to be a little bit drier and they tend to be a little bit shorter anyway. The only thing that flies against that is if they're sitting on a hot wall or something. But it's just keep in mind that if you're going to run it through a drip system that's very, very long, you want to think about how much volume is going into each pot. So again, I think anything over 150, I would tend to lower the volume, raise the rate. But that's just a personal preference technique. Know your injector is set right. Typically most people set the injector at 1 to 100, set up accordingly and go about this. Make sure your injector is where you think it is, and then test it. Make sure it's giving you the volume that you think it's giving you. It's pretty easy to do. You take the easiest way I've ever done is you just buy one graduated cylinder and you fill it full of a liquid, and you put the draw tube in that graduated cylinder, and then you have a 5-gallon bucket, and then you run that injector until that 5-gallon bucket's full, and then you look at how much liquid actually left that cylinder. It should be 1/100th of what's in that bucket. And if you are 1/100th, then your injector is accurately calibrated at 1 to 100. But don't trust in injector calibration. Seals wear out, especially if you use things like TrueBand through your portable injector. The grit in some of these wettable powders and drenches will eat away at the seals. The seals will allow things to leak through. Water tends to leak through, and you're not getting as much chemical as you think you are, because you're getting more blow-by. So again, know your injector, check your injector. If there's ever an excuse to calibrate your injector, I don't know if any of you have ever calibrated your injector, now is the time to do it when you talk about a bonsai drench.
I would recommend if you're only using if you're using liquid lime, make sure only one injector is using the liquid lime. Don't use the liquid lime through all the injectors.
Well, my worst experience, this will go back, this is an oldie but goldie. This goes back to into the early mid 1980s. Now's a Beauty in Florida, this huge plug range. We were full plugs and we used a lot of band rot. And we had this big, huge Anderson injector set that we were using to drench the band rot. We started in the morning, we stopped for lunch. The assistant grower forgot to stir the bucket. We then pulled band rot mud from the bottom of the injector and basically destroyed 4 Anderson heads in a matter of minutes. So know your injector, know it's doing what you think it's doing. Again, so this is a repeat slide just to shows the efficacy of that. James, you want to talk a little bit about this little trick?
All right, so we're holding our Cyathea here with paclitabustrosol bonsai applications at finish. So we're talking, you're getting to the fish lip stage at first sign of pollen, and that's when we want to apply. So we're going to apply it as a spray or a drench, depending on what you're kind of set up to do at this point of the point of the year. But it's a very specific window of when this will be effective, right?
Yeah, you want to catch it. Ideally, just put it this way: you're gluing that flower, the Cyathea. You're gluing it to the plant. You're also gluing it in place, so no more flower development will occur. No more Bract expansion will occur. So you want to do it when the plant is ready to sell before pollen. Once pollen starts to shed aggressively, that the fate of that particular flower is set. And the abscission will happen regardless of the bonsai application. So it's important to catch it at lips when the lips appear, the yellow part of the flower, and between lips and pollen, but know that nothing else will progress after that.
So it's a good point that nothing will progress afterwards, right? So we have these strategies and every year is a little bit different, right? So we might not be able to apply what we want to every year, depending on what we're seeing on the actual Bract development, right? We weren't paying attention to our ADTs early, so we're having a little bit late where our Bract development color isn't fully there, but our Cyathea is starting to shed pollen. Don't do it.
You got it.
The color is more important on the Bract than your Cyathea even being retained in the center. I hate to break to you, but we are plant nerds, okay? Even a basic grower is compared to our consumer, an extreme plant nerd. Most people, most of our consumers have no idea what we're talking about when we talk about Cyathea, but they will recognize if that Bract is not fully colored.
Yeah, that's an excellent point when you talk about any of these other variables that will affect your Bract development. You will get in situations like with heat delay and light delay, you will see the flower advance further than the Bract. And so when you're sitting there with your Bracts aren't expanded, don't use this technique. Excellent point, James. The Bract comes first. We're selling Bracts, not Cyathea. Cyatheas are a nice bonus, and we don't want them to fall out because that looks ratty. But we're selling Bracts. Just to go back. No, go ahead, James.
Both of these pictures, I would say that they're good examples on different varieties of when we can apply the bonsai, right? And there's just, first sign of pollen. The bottom one is a little less progressed, so we were a little bit more on top of it. But yes, they're good examples of when we should apply this strategy. And like all widespread strategies or changes, you only have one time a year. Trial this out first before we do it widespread.
Yep. I want to go back to when we were talking about PGR drenches. The one thing I didn't talk about, I said volume was critical, but I didn't give you any ideas what kind of volume to use. So the rules are vague. There are no rules. So what we've tried to do is create sort of a verbal guideline so that you have something that's consistent that you can educate your irrigators or the people that will be applying the drench to. And these rates, when we talk about the rates between a 20th and an 1/8 of a part per million, that's predicated on this assumption. And that assumption is 1 fluid ounce per inch diameter of the pot. So 6 fluid ounces on a 6-inch pot, 10 ounces on a 10-inch pot. Now that is not a rule. That's simply a way that if you have a language of consistency, when you do these applications, you will know how much efficacy you're going to have. If you don't have control over the volume, the response will be very different. So you can create your own set of rules, but just understand the rates that we're talking about. This 20th of a part on the very low end, up to an 1/8 of a part on the high end. This is all predicated and built around this premise of 1 fluid ounce per inch diameter of the pot. Now, the other thing you can throw in there when you start getting into bigger pots with bigger plants and you have multiple stems in there, you start thinking about in those terms, well, how much actual plant am I controlling? So at that point, you would consider increasing your volume. So like a 10-inch 4-stem pot, you might go up to maybe like 16 ounces in that particular situation. But the bottom line is whatever you do, make that rule and apply that rule and don't waver that rule. Don't make volume be a variable. The variable be frequency of application and rate, but make your volume language to your growing staff consistent. So every time you do the drench, you're doing the same volume.
And year to year, make sure that these rules within your organization and sort of flux we have with growing staff are not lost, right? We make rules so we can compare rates from year to year on variety to variety. But if we change the volume rule, for example, of how we like to operate within our operation year to year, then the rates become less useful for us to compare. We're starting to compare apples to oranges and not apples to apples in a year to year span.
I think that's, that's just, again, you talking about these sort of general grower principles is variables are what we try to learn and understand and manage. Constants are things that we can do that are part of the environment, part of our greenhouse structure, things that are fixed. So the more variables we have to juggle, the harder it is to identify exactly what variable is affecting what. So don't let the volume be a variable, make that a constant, and let the frequency and application be the variable. But I think that principle applies to everything we do in horticulture. You want to try to make as many constants as you can. The art of compromise, Dave Kransky, favorite term that he used years ago. Growing is the art of compromise. You have ideals, I can tell you, Dave will tell you, says, look, I can tell you exactly how to grow this species to the nth degree from the lab. But you are growing it next to 35 other species in a greenhouse. You need to figure out how to make that environment work for everything. The art of compromise. So what are the constants? Your water is a constant. Your environment's a constant. Your media is a constant. Maybe your feed regime's a constant. I don't know. But make constants and then juggle your variables. All right. Let's talk about another fun thing that, James, your turn.
We see this more and more, and this is unfortunate. And this is also one that will leave a grower scratching their head and frustrated. And again, back to my point of be friendly with your neighbors, because generally speaking, they're going to be your neighbors for much longer, right? And herbicide damage and drift from herbicide applications and cleaning your fields has popped up more often than I would like to see in my few years with Selecta.
And it's something that we deal with frequently. I've dealt with it from spray applications on an adjacent railroad track to residual in rice hulls and media to you name it. I mean, herbicide can come at you from so many different angles.
And even in our states that are harder on what people can spray, those are the ones that I've seen more instances of drift. Mm-hmm. From neighbors. Could also be because they're closer to their neighbors, their operations are, could be a case, right? So I don't assume that you are safe, right? Because it only takes one drift of an application.
The other thing that you have to do when you investigate these scenarios is you have to look, to James's point, where did it happen? Is it sitting next to a vent adjacent to that just freshly sprayed field? Is it, is it near the ditch? Is it throughout the greenhouse? Because the one thing that's almost impossible to do and unbelievably expensive to attempt to do is to identify that herbicide once it's in that plant. In most cases, you'll never get a positive hit, and you'll spend tens of thousands of dollars chasing it. So what you have to really do is look for wonky symptoms. And these are some pictures of different herbicide looks. Look for wonky symptoms and look for them in proximity. Eliminate the other options before you chase the herbicide. But the bottom line is you'll never have to actually prove it in the plant. It's almost impossible. I've seen it tried numerous times over my career, but I've yet to see anybody get a positive hit in the affected plant. Now, I've gotten positive hits on the weeds that died outside the vent, but we could never get a positive hit on the affected living, still alive plant. So you gotta do, this is a put under detective hat, but beware, it happens all the time. Poinsettias are like a New Guinean patient, hypersensitive.
Mm-hmm.
All right, James.
What do we got here? Improving shelf life, protecting your roots. We're cooling down towards the end. We're doing humidity control. All right. We're managing our botrytis on our bracts. We're using calcium chloride sprays. All of these things in a late bonsai drench or spray, essentially we're feeding to the end and storing and shipping cool. And we're improving the shelf life for not only our customer, but our customer's customer, right? And one of the best success stories I have is when growers, really the end consumer comes back and, oh, my poinsettia lasted for me all the way to January or, mid-January. And as any good salesperson and grower of plants, I remind them swiftly, please throw that out and get a fresh one next year. Because and this is the point where we improve the shelf life so long that we have some growers that get really excited and they're like, oh, I'll just try and grow it again. It's $6 to $15 and it'll look way better fresh every year.
Yeah. Now this is a highly programmed crop. But I think what's important here is, if you notice in this list, is most of these things are things that we talked about doing just to make the plant stronger, healthier anyway. Healthy plant has better shelf life. Now the cool down at the end and the late bonsai treatment, those are things you can specifically do. But everything else we talked about are the core principles we've been trying to teach you from day one. Grow a good, healthy, vital poinsettia. It will give you better shelf life.
Yep. And planning for next year. We like to think that we're perfect every year, but I'm sure there's things that we'd like to improve on, and a good grower will always have something they like to improve on. So make fresh notes every year. Evaluate from crop to harvest. There's going to be pitfalls, even with some of the genetics you might like at the back end, right? And just know how to work around those pitfalls, say in the propagation stage, or when you're out post pinch, you like this one particular variety so much that you do have to apply a little bit more cyclocells to shape the plant before you can go to your bonsai drench. Keep records of your ADTs. Take plenty of pictures, right? Because our memories, we see so many plants that from year to year, oh, was that the year that I had the perfect poinsettia? Or no, that was 2 years ago. Well, what did I do that, how is that different? Well, my ADTs were a little bit higher in the front end and then a little bit lower in the back end, and look through solutions for your different genetic issues. And the salesman hat, make sure you book what you want early, right? So you get it on the weeks that you want. So we don't have to, again, go from year to year comparing apples to oranges on crop scheduling.
Now, I think, James, keeping photographic record by date is important. Another thing is, a lot of guys like to use sort of like these crop stakes. This is one, we call this one the Guido stick. But basically this one is graduated. But the idea is you keep notes, the date, you write the date on the height as it goes up the stick. You write the variety on the back. You can write PGR applications. Then you take this, pull it out of the stock, you put the variety name on it, 6-inch pot, 6-inch Christmas Beauty, throw it in a box. Next year you come out, you stick this one from last year in a pot, and then you put a blank one in the pot next to it. And now you have a bar of exactly what happened day by day last year and everything you did last year in a stick, a plastic stick sticking in the pot.
I really like yardsticks for this. You know, you can get some nice durable yardsticks, right, and make it real simple on yourself. And that way you can mark it off by week. You know, you can make it as complicated as you want as a tracking system, but it is a wonderful history of what you did for that crop for that 4 to 5 months that you had it.
Yeah, and I think it's so important. You need to document in multiple ways, but do it. However, do you keep notes by date with photographs? That's fine, but you need to document what's happening right now so that you have that to refer to next year. It's always important. Now, there's variables, but you need to know as you go, because there's a lot to get it just right. There's a lot of moving parts to a poinsettia crop, and paying attention to what happened is paramount. So I think, you know, my 2 cents in the planning is keep a really good record of what you're doing right now so that you can learn what to not repeat and what to repeat next year.
The average poinsettia crop, you have it for 20 some weeks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And week 40 only comes once per year. And if you can't recall what week happened last week 40 previous year, it doesn't really help you in making decisions for your current week 40.
In every respect, this is a one-time-a-year crop. And you talk about crop, I'm talking about a combination of genetics, pot sizes, etc. But you get one shot at this a year. So you don't get to go like I'm planting geraniums every week for 8 weeks. You don't get to learn your lesson on week 2 and apply it in week 5. You get one shot at this. So keep records. It's important. All right, man. That's all we got for now. We're a resource. Use us. We're there to help.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we have a couple questions to get through here in the Q&A, and we'll start with this one came when you guys were talking about insect control. The question is, do biologicals geared towards standard greenhouse whiteflies also go after the banded whiteflies?
Yes, my understanding is they do, and that's based on, if you want to pursue that, probably the best place to look for that information is out of Vineland research, simply because there is we've seen banded whitefly in Ontario, and the team at Vineland and the growers in that area are leading the charge as far as biological control. So if there's an answer to be had that's really, really solid, it would come from, I would imagine it would come out of Vineland.
Okay, good. No, that's a good resource for sure.
Mm-hmm.
What about the humidity in the soil for growth control?
Humidity in the soil, that's kind of a loaded question. It really has to do with, you know, the water air root ratio. Right.
Yeah, you're getting into the point of like that moisture kind of going up into the canopy, right? And I would say if you're one way or the other, that's why we kind of recommend a more even track for your moisture management, because that if you're a little bit heavy on that, then you're going to start to get humidity in that lower part of your canopy, right? That microclimate's going to be quite hot. And that's when you can have your botrytis right down there on your lower stems, right?
Absolutely, but I think that if you're getting to the point where moisture evaporating off the soil becomes a disease factor for above the crop, it's going to be also giving you a lot of grief in the bottom of the crop as well. If your soil's too heavy, you'll be seeing algae growth, you'll be seeing fungus gnats raging, things like these. Other problems will become, I think, more prevalent around too much moisture coming out of the soil environment. And too much moisture coming out of the soil means your soil is either way too dense or you're watering too much.
Okay. There was a question.
The soil environment, I mean, not to misinterpret this, because it could be referring to the actual root zone. And yes, you do not want an anaerobic type root zone. Poinsettias do not like wet feet. They need that white, fluffy, fuzzy root. That fuzzy root is what gets the active transport that brings those nutrients into the plant. So if you're thinking about it on a microscale in the media itself, you need an open medium in that respect, so that you have good aeration around the roots.
Quick question. Where do you get those measuring sticks that you were holding up?
Well, we're working on the process of trying to figure out how to make these guys. This is the Guido stick. This is actually a breeder's tool. It was created by Selecta's poinsettia breeder Guido. It's very cool. It's in centimeters, mind you, but you literally cut it to the height of the poinsettia, stick it in the pot, and it tells you where you should be, and then you just mark your dates. So we're working on marketing person and I are working on trying to create some version of this that we can put out there. And again, just the backside is just for notes. Just a plastic stick, though. That's all you really need. Yardsticks, like I said, a lot of guys just go buy cheap yardsticks and mark them up and throw them in a box at the end of the year.
Yeah, I was one of those guys.
Mm-hmm. I did too.
Makes sense. Keep it simple. Save them from year to year. You've got kind of a baseline to work off of next year.
Yeah. So we're hoping that we will have for public consumption, if I can get the budget approved, a Guido stick.
Sounds good. Well, that actually wraps up our questions. So I just really want to say thank you guys for all of your time over the course of the last 3 webinars. Thank you so much for making this 3-part series possible. I think that the information that you shared was appreciated by all who attended. Arming growers with all this info shows the dedication of Selecta to the success of all greenhouse growers. And I think I'm speaking on behalf of everyone who followed these webinars from the beginning. Very grateful and really appreciate your time, Gary and James.
We're happy to do it.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And like I said to people out there, we are a resource. We are here to help you guys finish this crop. We know it's a high-tech crop, but it's a lot of challenges. So don't be bashful. Please reach out. We'll help you if we can.
Absolutely. So last but not least, I do want to remind everyone that all of our webinars are archived for your viewing pleasure. And really, if you want to go back and look through some of the charts that Gary and James shared, I know there's a lot of information there and a lot of it's specific to individual greenhouses. So take a look back into the archives. It's all at growertalks.com/webinars, including all 3 parts of this series. And also do want to shout out selecta1northamerica.com for some of the other charts and information and a link to the catalog, which shows all of the great poinsettia varieties from Selecta, as well as a lot of grower-facing information. Again, definitely want to thank everybody for attending these webinars and giving all of your time. Hopefully the information shared will help you produce your best crops ever. So, guess that's it for today. On behalf of our panelists at Selecta One, I'm Bill Calkins, Senior Editor with Grower Talks, wishing you a fantastic poinsettia season. And take care, you guys.